I'm Valerie Belknap, and I was Valerie Shapansky, my maiden name, when I was in voluntary service from 1981 to 82. What led me to go into Mennonite Voluntary Service was my best friend and I were planning on going to Cape and Ray, Austria for Bible school after we graduated high school, but at the same time I'd been to a youth meeting and they'd done some sharing about what Mennonite Voluntary Service was and what it did, and for whatever reason I applied for that at the same time, and the week I got my Cape and Ray, Austria acceptance letter, I also got my Mennonite Voluntary Service acceptance letter. So I had a choice to make, and I prayed a lot about it, and God told me that I needed to be going to Mennonite Voluntary Service in Liberal, Kansas. So it was pretty hard to tell my best friend I wasn't going to go with her to Cape and Ray, Austria, and she went and mailed me postcards when I was in VS. But it was the right choice for me, and it was definitely led by God. Then? I did my service was a 1-year service. You could opt for a 2-year, but I chose to stick with the 1 year as I went back home and attended Bible college after that. My assignment for Mennonite Voluntary Service was to live in a unit with 3 other girls, and we were to work at a daycare called Sunshine Daycare Center. That was a daycare center for underprivileged and poverty level families. We provided inexpensive or free daycare coverage for them, sort of in a preschool setting as well. We had a director, and we were associated with the Buhler Mennonite Church and the Turpin, Oklahoma Mennonite Church. Well, the 4 of us lived in a very tiny house, and we took turns. We had one vehicle when we got there as a unit vehicle. And so the first person who had to go early and open would usually take the car, and we all had different laundry doing dates. And so they would take the vehicle and the person's laundry for that day and drive to the daycare center. The rest of us would walk. Roughly, it was probably about a mile or so. We walked over train tracks in the city of Liberal, and then we would work, and then the last person to work the late shift would get to drive the vehicle home. And so that's kind of what we did. I taught the 3- and 4-year-olds in a little preschool class, and then we had shared playtime and meal time as well. So. My view of God probably changed throughout that year, as I was pretty young, obviously fresh out of high school, so I was 18. I'd never really been away from home for a long time before, and it was a really growing year. I grew more that year probably than I had in many years. You really relied on the faith community of the church that supported us, and just the experiences of what you were going through. You had no choice but to grow. You were serving others, but in the nice change on that, or switch up, however you want to say it, is that you grow as a person incredibly as well. I think that's what most people find from services. When you give to others, it gives back to you, and that was definitely an experience for me. Probably my personal growth was just the strength I had to be able to do the things I needed to do. I was quite homesick in the beginning, which I hadn't anticipated, and missing my family back home in the north. And so, and being in a different area, you know, I think I grew individually in my faith, and I did more reading and learning about different people. I think I just grew in leaps and bounds, really, compared to what I had been doing before that. And so I think the experience just was one that was very rich for me. Had a lot of really unique experiences throughout that year, and so learned a lot more about different cultures, because even though I grew up in a city that has many thousands of different people, I grew up in a pretty Mennonite area with a Mennonite Anabaptist school. We were pretty all pasty white, and so for me to be in a community that was very culturally diverse, a lot of Hispanic and African American, to be honest, the daycare had a cook named Josie. She was an old lady. She was just so full of she was wonderful. She was so fun and loving, but I couldn't understand her in the beginning. I would always have to look to my roommates to say, what did she say? Because her southern accent was so strong, and I was such a northern accent, I couldn't even understand her. And so, same with the pastor at the Buhler Mennonite Church, who happened to be Bob Dalkey at the time. He had such a southern accent. For me, I had to focus on the words and not just have fun listening to the unique accent. So it took a while for me to be able to clearly understand people. And while that's not a huge language barrier versus, Spanish-speaking people or anything like that, it was still a cultural growth for me that I hadn't had before. Definitely stayed in touch with my home church, which was Sargent Avenue Mennonite Church in Winnipeg. My mom's ladies footing group, they, I think, sent me some money for Christmas, which allowed me to fly home for Christmas to see my family. And they just always kept me in prayer, support, and sort of ascending when I left, and when I returned, they had me share about my experiences there as well to the congregation. So I always had a pretty tight connection back with my home church, which was good. Well, probably the growing thing, or that's something that I vividly remember, or that was pretty critical in the whole year, was the director of that child care center at the time had a mental breakdown, and he had shown up, and he always was there pretty early, and we hadn't really noticed much, and all of a sudden he disappeared, and everybody came looking at the daycare center. We had to search everywhere, like in closets, and we were looking everywhere to see if he was hiding somewhere or something, which was really strange, but he just disappeared. He had left his wife and children and had just driven off, and I remember the church had gotten planes in the air, and they had police force looking, and they were looking for him as a missing person. He was missing for 3 or 4 months before he just mysteriously came back. And it was a real awareness for me that I had not been aware that this person that we saw and spent time with every day had some mental health challenges. And I think that was my first glimpse of seeing somebody that was really hurting next to me, but being totally unaware of their pain. And so that was a growth experience. We were not trained fully. We had some training, but we weren't fully trained to watch out for signs of abuse or neglect or things like that. And so we had one little kid who was just scared of cows. And I think his dad worked at a slaughter place, and they would come with their clothes splattered with blood and pick up their kids, and he always had boogie cows. Everywhere's a boogie cow. And I think that just, while it was sad, it was funny. And just, we had children that would bang their heads on the walls repeatedly, and we would have to stop them from hurting themselves, and just a lot of children with challenging issues. And when I think about it, we were so young and probably not as experienced as we needed to be, but we loved and played, and they were always a kid sitting on your lap because they needed that attention. And so yeah, that was, loved all the little kids a lot. Recommending or advising young people to go into service is something I would definitely do. In Canada, the culture is a little bit different. Here in the United States, everybody graduates high school, and college is the expectation, or for the most part it is. But I think in Canada, they have much more, or at least where I was raised, the way I was raised was that service and MCC and MDS, those things were really ingrained into us, and so it felt natural to do what I was doing. I know we've had some people from our church who've made that choice too, and that's really neat to see. It is a personal decision, but I think making the kids aware of what's available in that, and letting them choose and having those options available, and just being free to talk about it as an option, I think is really important. I think we do that as a church. I think when I think about retirement, I think about ways that I'm going to serve and give back. I'm not one to sit around a lot, and so I like to be busy and active, and so I haven't really thought a lot about it. Part of me has wondered, what would it have been like if we had been a missionary family, and what would that have entailed. But I think it's something that at some point I wouldn't mind doing again or entertaining. Part of my year there also changed with one of our roommates decided to go home for the summer to Wisconsin. We were 4 girls from Illinois, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then me, Canada. And the Wisconsin gal decided to go back to her home state and attend a camp there for the summer that she volunteered at. Then she changed her mind, and they'd already gotten a replacement for her. And the problem with that is our house was really, really small. And I was the last one in on the unit, and some of them had been there almost 2 years, and they were ending their term in the summer. And so they chose me to go serve at Camp Menasca for the summer. And so I had had my orientation there, and I was quite honestly not super impressed with the place because it was sandy and hot. And I grew up where our church camps had horses and swimming pools and ropes courses and carpet. And so this was, you know, kind of a little more rustic. And I was not really impressed because I had joined the softball team for First National Bank and Liberal, and I had to give up some of those things that I had going personally as well. And they put me on a bus and sent me to Kingman, where I got off at midnight, and told me an old man, the director of the camp, would pick me up. Well, he had other plans, so he sent what's now my husband, Steve, to pick me up. And so I spent June, July, and all of August at the camp then, finishing out my VS year, which term ended in September then, before I returned to Canada, and really grew to love the camp. And I mowed, and I did kitchen work and counseling, and I filled in wherever they had a need. And so that was a pretty rich experience that ended up being a part of my VS year as well. So I feel fortunate in being able to have had that experience too.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.